December 1980. Cold War Europe. NATO tensions rising. American nuclear weapons stationed on British soil. Strategic air bases operating at high alert. And deep within a quiet forest in Suffolk, England, something happened. Not a blurry civilian sighting, not a late night conspiracy theory, but an incident involving trained US Air Force personnel, multiple military witnesses, official memoranda, recorded audio evidence, and one of the most controversial military UFO cases in history. The Rendlesham Forest incident, often called Britain's Roswell. But unlike Roswell, this case did not revolve around a crash recovery story. Instead, it centered around something potentially more unsettling: an active encounter. Witness entering the forest, military personnel allegedly approaching an unknown object, lights maneuvering through restricted military airspace, and perhaps most importantly, the incident occurred beside bases connected to NATO nuclear operations during the Cold War. That detail changes everything, because Rendlesham is not just a UFO story, it is a national security story, a military credibility story, a Cold War story, and decades later, it remains one of the most debated UAP incidents ever recorded. Tonight, we investigate what happened in Rendlesham Forest, the testimony of military witnesses, the Halt memo, the famous audio recording, the nuclear weapons connection, skeptical explanations, the evidence, the contradictions, and why this incident still matters in the modern disclosure era. This is UFO to UAP, the Disclosure Report, and I'm your host, Matt Tones. And tonight, we enter Rendlesham Forest. To understand Rendlesham, you first need to understand where it happened. RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge were not ordinary military facilities. They were strategically important Cold War air bases used by the United States Air Force in the United Kingdom. And according to multiple historical accounts, they were associated with NATO nuclear weapons storage during one of the most tense periods of the Cold War. That matters enormously because by 1980, the United States and Soviet Union existed inside a permanent atmosphere of nuclear anxiety. Military readiness was constant. Surveillance was consistent. Intelligence operations were constant, I should say. And any unknown object near a strategic military facility represented a serious concern. Not because military officials believed in aliens, but because they feared Soviet technology, surveillance incursions, classified aerospace breakthroughs, or threats to nuclear infrastructure. That is the lens through which Rendlesham must first be viewed. Not fantasy, not science fiction, but military uncertainty. The incident began in the early hours of December 26, 1980. Security personnel stationed near RAF Woodbridge reported unusual lights descending into Rendlesham Forest. Initially, some personnel believed an aircraft may have crashed. That alone justified immediate investigation. Two servicemen became central to what followed: Airman First Class John Burroughs and Staff Sergeant Jim Penniston. Both entered the forest to investigate the disturbance, and according to their testimony, what they encountered was unlike anything they had seen before. The men described strange lights moving through the trees, unusual illumination, a glow that appeared controlled rather than random. Then came the most controversial claim of the entire incident. Penniston later stated they encountered a triangular craft resting within the forest clearing, not hovering, not distant, but allegedly on or near the ground itself. He described smooth metallic surfaces, unusual markings, strange symbols, colored lights, and an object behaving unlike conventional aircraft. Now, pause here, because this is where disciplined analysis becomes essential. There is no universally accepted physical proof confirming a landed extraterrestrial craft. No recovered material publicly verified. No authenticated military photographs released confirming the object. What we have is testimony, military testimony, and that distinction matters because witness testimony can be sincere while still remaining disputed. According to Penniston, he moved closer enough to physically touch the object. This detail became one of the defining elements of the Rendlesham story. Penniston later described unusual surface textures, unusual strange symbols, and intense psychological impressions during the encounter. Years later, his claims expanded further, including allegations involving binary code sequences, cognitive downloads, and time-related symbolic information. Now, this is important. Those later claims are highly controversial, and they did not emerge immediately after the incident. And that timing matters, because investigators distinguish between immediate contemporaneous testimony and later evolving recollections. Critics argue later additions weaken credibility. Supporters argue trauma and delayed processing may explain evolving memories. But from an investigative standpoint, we must separate what was reported immediately from what emerged decades later. That distinction is critical for serious analysis. Very quickly, skeptical explanations emerged. The most famous involved the Orford Ness Lighthouse. The lighthouse beam rotated at regular intervals and was visible through portions of the forest. Skeptics argue the moving light, atmospheric conditions, stress, darkness, and expectation may have created misinterpretation. Other skeptical explanations include bright stars, meteors, military confusion, optical distortion, fatigue, and environmental disorientation. These explanations cannot simply be ignored, and this is where Rendlesham becomes genuinely difficult, because unlike weak UFO cases, Rendlesham contains credible witnesses, conflicting interpretations, official military involvement, but no definitive resolution. That combination keeps the case alive. Supporters of the incident reject the lighthouse theory because witnesses claimed movement inconsistent with the lighthouse. The object allegedly appeared inside the forest. Some descriptions involved structured craft-like forms, and military personnel insisted the event was far more complex than a distant rotating light. But skeptics counter. Human perception at night is highly unreliable, especially under stress, and history contains many examples of sincere witnesses misinterpreting unusual conditions. Both sides make important points, which is why Rendlesham remains unresolved. Then things escalated. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt entered the story. Halt was not a random civilian witness, he was the deputy base commander, a senior military official, and his involvement transformed Rendlesham from a strange military rumor into one of the most important military UFO cases ever documented. On December 28th, Halt led a team into Rendlesham Forest to investigate reports of unusual activity. Crucially, he carried a tape recorder, and what happened next became legendary. The Halt tape remains one of the most famous audio recordings in UFO history. On the tape, you can hear military personnel reacting in real time, describing strange lights, excitement, confusion, and apparent aerial movement. At one point, Holt describes the lights maneuvering rapidly through the trees and sky. The emotional authenticity of the recording is one of the reasons the case became so influential, because regardless of interpretation, the reactions sound genuine, not staged, not theatrical, not bewildered. Sorry, but bewildered, I should say there. Then came the document that elevated Rendlesham permanently into UFO history, the Halt Memo. Charles Halt formally documented the events in an official memorandum sent to the UK Ministry of Defence. This matters enormously because very few UFO cases produce military witnesses, audio recordings, and official military paperwork. The memo described unexplained lights, unusual movement, animal disturbances, radiation measurements, and aerial phenomena. This became one of the most cited official military UFO documents ever released publicly. Now, importantly, the Halt memo did not claim aliens landed. It documented unexplained observations. That distinction is important, and this is one reason the document retains credibility decades later. It avoided sensational conclusions. Instead, it documented uncertainty, which is exactly what serious military reporting should do. One of the most controversial aspects of the case involves radiation measurements. According to reports, small elevated readings were allegedly detected in areas associated with the sightings. Supporters argue this suggests something unusual physically interacted with the environment, where skeptics disagree strongly. Critics argue the readings were low, may have fallen within normal environmental variation, and were not scientifically extraordinary. Additionally, questions emerged regarding calibration, methodology, environmental contamination, and of course, interpretation. Again, this is why Rendlesham remains difficult. The evidence is suggestive but not definitive, interesting but disputed, which is often where the strongest UFO cases exist. Not proven, not disproven, stuck permanently in ambiguity. Now we arrive at perhaps the most important part of the entire case, the nuclear connection. Because Rendlesham did not occur near an ordinary location, multiple researchers and former personnel have claimed RAF Bentwaters was associated with nuclear weapons storage during the Cold War. If true, this dramatically changes the significance of the incident, because across UFO history, one pattern appears repeatedly: nuclear sites, missile silos, weapons facilities, strategic military infrastructure, again and again. UFO reports cluster around them. This pattern appears in American missile bases, Soviet nuclear regions, NATO facilities, and strategic military zones. Why? There are several possibilities. One, coincidence. Two, high military surveillance naturally produces more reporting. Three, classified military testing overlaps with strategic facilities. Four, something genuinely anomalous appears drawn toward nuclear infrastructure. We do not know, but Rendlesham fits directly into this larger historical pattern, and that is one reason modern UAP researchers continue studying it seriously. The British Ministry of Defence eventually acknowledged holding files related to the incident, but publicly, the MOD maintained the event did not represent a threat to national security. This is important because the government did not fully endorse extraordinary claims, but neither did the incident disappear completely. Instead, Rendlesham entered a strange middle ground: acknowledged, documented, but unresolved. And that pattern feels very familiar in the modern UAP era, because today's disclosure environment often works exactly the same way. Governments acknowledge reports exist, anomalies exist, investigations exist, while avoiding definitive conclusions. Rendlesham may have been decades ahead of its time in that regard. Many UFO stories fade quickly. Rendlesham did not. Why? Because it contains several extremely rare elements simultaneously: multiple military witnesses, senior officer involvement, official memoranda, recorded audio, Cold War context, strategic military location, nuclear weapons association, and decades of ongoing testimony. Very few cases combine all of these. That combination gives Rendlesham extraordinary staying power, and importantly, the witness largely maintain their accounts for decades. That consistency strengthened public interest significantly, even though disagreements and contradictions still exist. Now, let's fairly assess the skeptical perspective because skeptics raise important concerns. They argue no physical craft was recovered. Witness memories evolved over time. Environmental conditions were confusing. Lighthouse effects were underestimated, and extraordinary conclusions are unsupported by hard evidence. Some skeptics also argue the case grew larger over time through media amplification, that later retellings became more dramatic than the original events. This criticism is not unreasonable, and any serious analysis must acknowledge it. Because Rendlesham's reputation was shaped not only by the incident itself, but by decades of documentaries, books, interviews, and cultural mythology. Over time, stories naturally evolve, especially when mystery is involved. So why does Rendlesham matter today? Because the modern UAP era changed how historical cases are viewed. After Arrow, Pentagon acknowledgements, military footage releases, congressional hearings, whistleblower allegations, people began re-examining older military UFO cases more seriously, not necessarily as proof of extraterrestrials, but as examples of institutional response to anomalies, military uncertainty, intelligence compartmentalization, and unexplained encounters within strategic environments. Rendlesham suddenly felt modern again because the same theme continued appearing. Military witnesses, sensor uncertainty, institutional caution, ambiguous explanations, and unresolved anomalies. That continuity matters. Another reason Rendlesham remains fascinating is because it exists at the intersection of perception, memory, institutional authority, and mystery. Even if some aspects were misinterpreted, the emotional impact on witnesses appears genuine. And that raises difficult questions. What happens when trained military personnel encounter something they cannot explain? How does stress shape memory? How does institutional skepticism affect witnesses afterwards? Several Rendlesham participants later described ridicule, isolation, and dismissal, and psychological strain. That pattern also appears repeatedly across UFO history. Whether the phenomenon is extraordinary or not, the human impact can be very real. Ultimately, Rendlesham forces us to confront a difficult possibility. Not necessarily aliens visited Britain, but something perhaps more complicated. What if military institutions occasionally encounter events they genuinely cannot explain in real time? Not because the phenomena is extraterrestrial necessarily, but because uncertainty is built into reality itself. That possibility matters because governments are designed to project certainty. Military systems are designed around central control. And incidents like Rendlesham expose moments where certainty breaks down, where trained observers confront ambiguity, where official explanations fail to fully satisfy everyone involved, and where mystery survives. That may be the real legacy of Rendlesham Forest. More than 4 decades later, the Rendlesham Forest incident remains unresolved. No definitive proof, no definitive debunking, just layers of testimony, documentation, skepticism, military records, and unanswered questions. Was it a lighthouse misinterpretation or Cold War confusion, classified military technology, psychological distortion, or something genuinely anomalous? We still don't know, and I'd love your thoughts in the comments. But what makes Rendlesham extraordinary is not certainty. It is credibility under uncertainty. Military personnel, strategic installations, official documentation, and recorded reactions, and a mystery that refused to disappear. That is why Rendlesham remains one of the most important UAP cases ever discussed, not because it proves extraterrestrial visitation, but because it reveals how governments, institutions, and human beings respond when confronted with something they cannot fully explain. And perhaps that is the true heart of the UFO mystery itself. Not uncertainty, but the persistence of the unknown. This has been UFO to UAP, the Disclosure Report. I'm your host, Matt Tones. Thank you for tuning in.